The medieval period can be characterized by many major things: the Black Plague, the Hundred Years' War, or Christianity becoming the strongest force in Europe there was. It was something that bound most of Europe together as pagan beliefs began to slowly slip away. While this had some positives, it meant that more people were becoming educated. It allowed for more communication to reach across different areas. It also led to the further oppression of women and ideas around women's sexuality becoming more heavily doused in ideas of purity and male ownership and control. However, were the day-to-day lives of women actually like that? Were they heavily controlled like how we perceive it to be? Or was it more nuanced? The answer is obviously the latter. Everything is always more nuanced than we originally always think. The medieval period often gets a slightly bad rep by people. During the Enlightenment, it was often referred to as the Dark Ages, and this idea began to circulate that very little development happened during these years. And that's quite a statement to make, considering that the medieval period lasted from about 500 AD to about 1500 AD, but people disagree slightly on the exact years of it. I've seen some historians just label it as being from 1000 to 1500, whereas some seem to say 1800 to 1300, but if we sort of work in that approximate ballpark, we'll start to see the medieval period, or the Middle Ages, as other people refer to it. While it can be referred to as the Dark Ages, it's characterized often by things like the Hundred Years' War or the Black Plague, which were gruesome events. A lot of people also like to think that it was a period purely characterized by war and violence, that people were constantly fighting and constantly dying in battle. However, this is also a slightly incorrect statement. Wars and battles would take large breaks during harvest seasons and to accommodate for the weather, so wars were sort of seasonal. In all of this, women are a largely untouched subject by historians in the medieval era, well, at least till recently. In about the 1970s, women's history began to arise as its own discipline, and lots of incredible discussions began to arise around it. And medieval history focusing on women is still relatively unexplored compared to a lot of other aspects of it. Today, I'll be using one of my current favourite books, Women's Lives in the Medieval Europe, a source book, edited by Emilie Amt. It's very, very good and very, very useful for this discussion, and most of the sources I will discuss I have taken from this book. I've also been reading this book called Poet, Mystic, Widow and Wife by Hetta Howes, so I'll be repeating some of the ideas that I've read from this in this video as well. A lot of my other research has largely come from finding articles on JSTOR, and I'll put a little list in the description of the major sources and materials that I use to put together this discussion. If there's anything that I forget to label, my bad. But this isn't like a super official thing or anything, so it doesn't really matter. Now, we've covered the sort of basics of the medieval period and the basics of women's history relating to the medieval period. Something that's always really interested me is that lots of different periods in history get weirdly mischaracterized and weirdly interpreted in a way that doesn't necessarily make sense or really encapsulate what the actual period was like. A lot of common myths and lies tend to circulate around things, to the point that large amounts of the population will walk around believing certain ideas. They'll get this picture in their head that the Middle Ages were sort of, as I said, purely times of war, and there was very little development socially, culturally, academically, when those are all obviously insane statements to make. For example, Europe, which is sort of, Europe is basically, when we talk about the Middle Ages, we're talking about Europe. other places in the world they have different sort of names for their periods of time. So just getting that out there. The Middle Ages, it gets sort of diminished into this way that is quite unflattering. Despite the fact it saw the development of numerous universities around Europe, and it saw technological advancements, advancements in medicine, and very strong understanding of nature and astrology were developing, or being continued to be developed. There is also very interesting literature from this period, and I find some of the early literature very, very interesting. It's often quite sort of sorrowful because it's covering a period, especially in British history of literature, it's covering this weird period where they were recovering from the loss of sort of Roman civilization in Western Europe. We also sort of start to see, well, not start to see, at the very start of the period, we pretty much have seen the downfall of the Roman Empire, especially in Western Europe, and there's still sort of aspects of it still continuing on in the Eastern Front, but its power is being lost. And instead, you're getting these sort of large sort of areas banding together and starting to become, sort of more akin to the countries we see today. We start to see kind of France develop, and the Habsburg Empire begins to sort of develop as itself, and the British Isles start to become more unified, rather than sort of these warring tribes that have been going against each other for a very long time. We see the church, the Catholic Church, really solidify its power over Europe and over many of the monarchs throughout Europe. And this is sort of before the period of sort of the Enlightenment, and before we start seeing various countries turned towards Protestantism or Lutheranism. Lutheranism, is that the word? Luther? Following the teachings of Martin Luther, basically. And instead we see them moving towards, the Church of England, or various German states moving towards Protestant beliefs and such. Obviously, the Protestant Church, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't treat women that differently to the Catholic Church, in this period at least, when it moved over in sort of the 1500s. But one could argue that there was more sort of fairness, especially when it came to, I suppose, divorce and stuff. But the Catholic Church is really sort of the reigning power in this period. And that also means that the Catholic Church, like in lots of history, religious institutions have been the sort of havens of knowledge, the sort of the center of education and university education. And if one wants to learn how to read or develop an understanding of humanities or maths or anything, you weren't necessarily from a aristocratic class, your option was to become a monk or a nun. So this kind of means that basically everything, every source there is from this period is from a religious official, whether it's a nun, a monk, a bishop, a priest, etc., or it's from an wealthy aristocrat. While there was a merchant class, this merchant class is an area that I don't know that much about, so I'm not going to be touching on them too much. This means that it is difficult at times to find information out about the day-to-day lives of sort of peasants and lower class individuals. But at the same time, it's sort of difficult to find information on women everywhere because it's so often they're not the center of the attention. However, when looking at women's history, it's quite important to sort of look between the lines and look in places that aren't necessarily what you'd originally think is hiding information on women. While I seem to be slandering the Catholic Church quite a lot, their information that they provide around women is actually incredibly useful and interesting, I think. We see it as a way that women rose through the ranks and developed power and influence over people. We find numerous nuns becoming very powerful individuals, whether it was as appearing as a mystic or simply having sort of influence over communities. We have Julian of Norwich. We can also read between the lines of the things that the church are warning people not to do and saying, oh, if you do this, you're going to go to hell, or if you do this, you're going to have to, do penance. That can be quite the sort of suggestion that people are actually doing these things instead of everyone simply following what the church is saying. Now, this sort of survivorship bias of the people who wrote the story are monks and nuns, famously people who don't have sex. However, this is quite the claim to make, and factually untrue. For example, in Dijon, one of the brothels reported that 20% of their sort of customers were, in fact, church officials. And if we look at other sources, it wasn't just the men who were simply breaking their vow. We also find that women were also breaking this vow of abstinence as well. During visitations of nunneries in France, Eudes of Rouen reports finding that at one nunnery in particular, a Joan of I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. Joan of l'Allier at one time left the cloister and went to live with a certain man and had a child by him. And sometimes she goes out to see said child. Item, she is ill-famed of a certain man called Gaillard. He also goes on to say that Joan of Hautesville wanders beyond the priory alone with Gaillard, and last year she had a child by him. He goes on to label many other nuns at this nunnery who is ill-famed with a Philip of Villacreux and a certain priest in her neighbourhood. They also talk about a sister who is meant to be having meetings with a man called Crispin, and a prior of Gisors comes to see a lady called Adonia. There is many, many examples of this, more than you'd think. Quite juicy gossip, I would say. Shout out to the nunnery at Montevilliers, that seems to be the only one that is found to have everything in good condition. In another account, Eudes of Rules, whatever I said, they talk about taking the veil away from an Alice of Rouen and from Eustasia of Etrepagne because of their fornications. He then talks about Eustasia, as reported, gave some herbs to drink in order to kill the child already conceived within said Eustasia. A very interesting little highlighting of medieval abortions. First statement, which I feel is important to make. Obviously, these nuns, we don't know if the relationships they were having and the encounters they were having were completely consensual. That is statement number one. Statement number two is that I think that probably some of them were consensual. These nuns were often in pretty decently sort of good positions in society. They were living in a, generally a woman-only environment. They had their basic needs were met and provided for. They didn't have to seek out relationships in a way to protect themselves or provide for themselves. I think it's likely that these relationships were because of enjoyment. For example, the first one, I think that she visits the child and goes to stay with the child, and I assume the father, suggests that there's maybe at least some sort of goodwill between them. But who's to say? Obviously, we don't know the details. But rape was something that was considered to be a heinous crime and it wasn't looked it was seen to be bad, and there were punishments for it. To say how well it was sort of actually punished, and if every single case was taken completely seriously, obviously is debatable, and I haven't read through every single document that is reporting what happened after a rape case in the medieval period, but I'm sure somebody out there has. So wherever you are, give me the info. If we look at law concerning rape, we find just some examples of aspects to it. They do have a process for examining women after a rape has occurred, and a process for punishing men who rape women. A responsibility is placed on the local duke to watch over the proceedings and make sure everything goes according to plan. There's even laws set out to explain what to happen rape concerning prostitutes, and that if a prostitute is taken by force and does not give her price, and sorry, if anyone takes a prostitute by force and does not give her price, he shall be in the duke's mercy. The prostitute will be reimbursed and her damages shall be paid. If her clothes have been torn or anything like that. So while there are aspects of how rape was treated in the medieval period that weren't necessarily completely favourable and would be seen as a little bit insane in today's standards, there were laws around rape and trying to offer victims at least some compensation for the crime that they had endured. However, because everything was so heavily enshrouded in Christianity and Catholic beliefs, it meant that even the law was heavily entwined with it. One thing that is probably considered strange by today's standards, however, I think this sentiment probably still continues in today's ideas and sort of conceptions around rape. There was a belief that Jesus Christ, part of the reason he was so pure was that during conception, Mary, mother of Jesus, orgasmed during conception, and this was the first orgasm, and it's why Jesus was such a pure being. This idea spread, and it became this notion that for a baby to be born, the mother must orgasm during sex. It came this idea that the mother had to orgasm during sex to get pregnant. Obviously, we know this isn't actually true, but it is an interesting sort of way that they did seem to be sort of pushing the idea of female pleasure during sex. However, this had the negative connotation that if a rape resulted in pregnancy, it would no longer be seen as rape, because it could then be said that, well, the woman orgasmed, that means she found pleasure from it, she enjoyed the act, so it can't be considered rape anymore. And that is obviously not great. But this idea, I mean, it still presents itself today. A lot of people, will say, oh, well, if someone orgasmed during rape or sexual assault, that obviously meant that they actually enjoyed it, and then it wasn't rape. It's interesting how we can trace these horrible ideas that still present themselves in society to so long ago. Now, so far, I think I've probably been painting quite the negative picture of women's pleasure and enjoyment of sex in the medieval period. However, this isn't to say that everybody had totally negative ideas around it. For example, in the City of Ladies, um, there is a sort of quote from it that refers to the instinct of the flesh, which is effectively just a fancy way of saying getting horny. At least that's how I interpret it. We also get reports of aristocratic women, such as Christine and a man called Etienne, having unions, marriages that were enjoyed and they liked them. They had a good time getting married and being with one another. Um, I think marriage in the medieval period is also something that often gets quite a bad rep by people. Um, for, for example, um, and I think there is often this idea that people were getting married at incredibly young ages and everyone was a child bride. Um, and well, there were definitely child brides and child grooms. This wasn't really the norm. Um, the average age for marriage in England was about 17 for a woman and 20 for men. This is in 15th century England, so 1400s, which is the latter half of the medieval period. But even earlier on in this period, the ages, I don't believe so. I don't think they differed that much. And amongst peasants and labourers, who made up the vast majority of the population, the average age was a bit higher in the early to mid 20s for both sexes. Um, the only ones who were ever getting married as young as what I've seen some people be like, oh, people have got married at like 5 years old. The only ones ever getting married at that age were people in royal families, really. Um, and the odd, like very high standing, you know, aristocrat. Most people weren't getting married at that age. There were definitely engagements, but these engagements effectively didn't really mean anything. They were things written on a piece of paper, a contract that was drawn up, and you weren't, there was nothing promiscuous happening. So, you know, also marriage itself in the Middle Ages, it looked very different to how we view it today. A marriage didn't even had to be sort of stood before God and officiated by a priest or a bishop or anything. It was just two people agreeing that they were now married. This obviously led to some trouble here and there because sometimes two people could say, oh, we're married now, but then at a later date, usually a man would then go, oh, I didn't agree to that. And it was basically a way in which people could have sex. And then a man could be like, oh, I never said that. And then the woman would be left in poor standing. Um, However, marriage itself, through the Christian lens, was something that, despite the fact that women did not have the same privileges, there were certain aspects that I think that has a connotations that do promote that women were valued in these relationships and weren't simply just seen as sort of an item to be bought or anything like that, um, or sort of like livestock or anything. Um, in sort of the Catholic lens, there was this idea that men and women owed sex to each other equally, and it wasn't that sex was something that would only happen if the man wanted it. It was something that they both, if one of them wanted it, the other one owed it to the other, which doesn't have the best sort of connotations to it, but it does highlight that they did see that women were able and fully capable of feeling sexual desire, which is different to other periods where there is almost this idea that women have no desire at all. Um, I think it's interesting how that sort of changes throughout history and develops and differs and such. And sex itself wasn't necessarily some incredibly vanilla act where the only point of it was to, become pregnant. It People were like getting kind of crazy with it. um the Burkhard of Worms in Germany, I think. There's a really interesting sort of piece written by him where he warns against doggy style, he warns against sex toys, he warns against contraception. Um, in it, he talks about, well, he goes, have you done what certain women are accustomed to do? That is, to make some sort of device and implement in the shape of a male member of the size to match your desire, and you have fastened it to the area of your genitals or those of another with some form of fastenings, and have fornicated with another woman, or others have done with a similar instrument or another sort with you. If you have done this, you shall do penance for 5 years on legitimate holy days. Basically, in sort of layman's terms, he's talking about making a strap on and using it with another woman. The fact that he's writing an entire paragraph, an entire statement about this, to me does suggest, at least, that women were doing this. How many? We don't know. However, I would say if it was simply, if one woman in all of Europe did this, I don't know if he'd feel the need to write all this, to include it. I think that it's more likely that it was more common than one might think. However, while there were, and in churches and in, the Catholic Church, and we get this idea that everyone believes in this very sort of pure, modest society, but I think it's quite clear that not everyone was abiding to that sort of rule set. Um, and not everyone was totally liberal about this. A source from a Jewish man, he talks about the advice that he'd give to his daughters, and he does, he says he wants them to take, like, godly, respectable husbands who, are good and kind and have good friends and such, that and those sort of things. But he also does point out quite distinctly that his daughters should uphold modesty, which I think was probably a belief upheld by people, but I imagine it was something that probably differed, especially with classes. Um, when it came to sort of peasants and things, people were able to sort of more date. You could spend time getting to know someone and, you know, maybe meet at like the pub or at a village like festival or something like that. Aristocrats had the sort of different situation of they would they could court, but more not like dating, courting. It was more of a kind of, we've picked out who you're going to marry, so you can have a meeting and see if you like them. Because in a lot of laws from this period, there does seem to be quite the anti-sentiment to the idea of forcing, especially forcing anyone into a marriage and forcing women into a marriage. And I've seen repeatedly, and when I was looking through the laws section, they do say numerous times a woman needs to be agreeable, her family needs to be agreeable to this. Um, they can't just be forced into the marriage. Um, there is, in the section about rape in the legal system, in, I think it's in France, in this period, um, it talks about how a rapist can marry his victim, which is something that I've seen people bring up when they try to sort of make the medieval period seem really terrible and dastardly. But the latter half of that law goes on to say, if the woman and her family are agreeable, um, so there's not like a forcing to marry. And I'm certain that there were definitely situations in which women were forced to marry people they didn't like. But I don't know if it was as widespread as people want to present. But obviously, I don't know for certain, and I'm not an expert on this topic or anything. So if you know better than me, please say. It's, you know, I'm, I suppose, like context on me. I'm a history and classics graduate, and I sort of work like in the heritage sector, sort of. So I'm not going to explain my fucking job history to you guys. And I'm very, very interested in history and in heritage and all these things. And the medieval sort of period with women has been sort of a recent fascination of mine. Um, but I'm definitely no expert and I don't know everything. Well, I don't think anyone knows everything, but I think there's lots more reading and research I need to do on this topic. So this is very much just a sort of me talking about aspects that have been interesting to me and that I've enjoyed reading about and I think cool and the sort of conclusions that I've come to. But I always want to learn more and see if the conclusions I've come to change and differ once I found out new information. I think that's like a fun part of learning is seeing the conclusions you've made change and become something else. Um, okay. I think that this discussion is important. I mean, I think any discussion about history is important. However, I think discussing attitudes and the ways sexuality and sex and pleasure have been written is very important in the current climate. We often like to present this idea of a sort of a history of progress, that we've been steadily getting better and we're more sort of developed than past generations. Um, However, I think that's a load of nonsense. Um, I think during the Enlightenment, they try to refer to the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages. I think as a way to make themselves feel like more enlightened, to make themselves feel more that they were becoming more developed and more cultural and academic and better religiously. They're putting themselves on this pedestal. And we still do that to an extent. We're always being like, oh, we're better than we were 100 years ago. We're better than we were 200 years ago. We're better than we were 20 years ago. When really, we're just humans, and humans have always been capable of the same things. I think there is this attitude, especially around certain circles, far right circles, heavily religious circles, that we as a society were once more modest, more pure, more, people didn't have sex outside of marriage. We weren't sexually promiscuous. People weren't gay. People weren't lesbian. People weren't transgender, all of these things. But when you look at history, you see that all those statements are not really, it's like not true. People were sexually promiscuous. People did have sex outside of marriage. The sex people were having inside of marriage wasn't just for the sake of making children. People were lesbians, people were gay, people were transgender, all of these things. People had abortions. However, a lot of these circles like to present this idea that none of these things happened and that it was almost like a utopia where everyone was incredibly religious and everyone was so obedient to God and all of these things, which is dangerous, especially I think in the current climate we have. We're seeing, you know, lots of different organizations push these concepts, a lot of the time relying on these narratives that, we've become some sort of degenerate society. The Catholic Church still, refers to being gay as a sin. the Mormon church pushes for no sex outside of marriage or before marriage. Governments are still barring abortions around the world and trying to control ideas around sexuality and identity. Um, Oftentimes relying on the narrative that these sort of bad things that we do are things that we didn't used to do, and we need to sort of go back to how we used to be. But what if we never were that way? What if this sort of history, an idea they're presenting, never existed? Then sort of the propaganda begins to fall apart and you can't believe it anymore. So I think I'll stop there because I've been rambling for 40 minutes and I'm going to try and make this video shorter than that by cutting out all the bits where I just stared off into distance. I hope you enjoyed listening to my statements. If anyone has watched, you know, who knows. But I think I'm gonna try and make another video at some point and talk about another topic that I find interesting. Um, yeah, thank you. Have a good day, and like I don't know, leave a comment on if you have any kind of opinion, or you don't agree with something I've said, or you do agree with something I've said, or you have a statement to make. But I don't comment if you're gonna say something weird. I'm joking. Wait, no. I'm gonna say new ending. Um, yeah, so like and subscribe. Like and subscribe. God, yeah, thank you for watching and I hope you have a good day. Ta-ta. Cheerio.